Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the shadowy corridors of England's history, where power was not only built on swords and thrones, but also on secrets. So disturbing you might find them hard to believe. Imagine yourself standing in a splendid palace, torchlight flickering on damp stone walls, golden tapestries hanging down to hide things no one dared to speak of. At the center of that room is a queen, not with a proud smile, but with eyes haunted by an unusual hunger. She is Mary I. The woman history has tied to a chilling nickname, England's Cannibal Queen. Trust me, when you hear this story, you may feel it's hard to survive it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to know, where are you watching this video from? And what time is it where you live? Is it the stillness of midnight? Or the noise of a busy day? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine standing in the grand hall of Whitehall Palace, where candlelight glimmers against walls draped in embroidered gold. The air seems regal, but if you listen carefully, you won't hear the gentle strum of a lute or the soft laughter of courtiers, but tense whispers, like wind slipping through cracks in the door. At the very center of that space, Mary I, a small woman with a gaze full of determination, is trying to convince her court that she, at all costs, will give England a legitimate heir. You might smile a little, centuries have passed. Yet the pressure of producing an heir back then feels oddly similar to the pressure of releasing a new iPhone every year now. Without it, the public grows restless, doubtful, and quick to lose faith. What made Mary's case particularly tragic was this: she believed her own body was the most vital instrument to secure power. Historians recorded that just 1 year after marrying Philip II of Spain, Mary announced joyful news: she was pregnant. The entire country danced in celebration. Churches rang their bells in triumph, and a golden cradle was prepared for the future prince. But no child appeared. Mary's swelling belly, it turned out, was not pregnancy, but signs of an illness, perhaps ovarian cysts, perhaps a hormonal disorder. Historians still debate the truth. Was it only a phantom pregnancy caused by an obsessive mind? Or was she afflicted with the rare condition of false pregnancy? Picture the scene: the court eagerly waiting for the royal newborn, only to be met with silence. If social media had existed back then, the hashtag number royal baby would have gone viral, only to turn into mocking memes about false alarms. Months later, a royal tragedy, but one that feels eerily like modern-day drama. It didn't stop there. Mary tried strange remedies to fix the problem. Some records suggest she invited physicians and seers to the palace, conducting secret rituals, burning incense, even applying strange powders to her stomach. Today it sounds like someone scrolling TikTok for folk remedies. But back then, it was her desperate grip on hope. Many even believed she was cursed or haunted by ancestral shadows. Meanwhile, Philip, her cold and distant husband, seemed barely concerned. For him, the marriage was nothing more than a political contract. He spent more time on campaigns in Europe than at Mary's side. This only deepened her despair, because the only love and hope she had turned away at the moment she needed it most. Imagine buying a new computer to save your career, only to find out it couldn't even run Word. An official moment in history highlights her obsession in the year 1555. Mary again declared she was with child. Once more, the nation prepared to celebrate, but history repeated itself. No child was born. This time, there were no cheers, only suspicion, fear, and whispers. What is strange is that while Mary sank deeper into this obsession, her reign was marked by a notorious title, Bloody Mary. At the very same time, she ordered hundreds of Protestants burned alive to restore Catholicism. Historians still debate, was her brutality driven solely by faith? Or did the pain of her body and her failure as a mother fuel her cruelty? Some scholars argue her harshness was simply a way to reclaim control. If she couldn't control her womb, at least she could control her subjects. Close your eyes and imagine London filled with the smoke of burning stakes. Yet inside the palace, Mary sat alone in her chamber, staring blankly at her belly, wondering why her own body had betrayed her. There is something both chilling and heartbreaking here, more like a psychological drama than a political story. And then, as time passed, Mary's health only worsened. She suffered from many ailments, menstrual disorders, stomach pains, even kidney disease. Some accounts say she lived constantly surrounded by the smell of herbal medicines, the scent of candles, and the low murmur of priests praying. The entire palace seemed to have turned into a royal patient's clinic. This scene almost invites a sarcastic laugh. A royal palace that should have echoed with music now resembled a miniature national hospital. The only thing missing was a take a number sign hanging in the hallway. What must be said is that these crises did not only destroy Mary, but also dragged the whole country into a whirlpool of instability. With no child, the biggest question arose: who would succeed to the English throne? And the bitter twist was this: the successor was none other than Elizabeth, the half-sister, a Protestant, completely opposed to Mary's faith and lifelong struggle. Do you see the irony? All the years Mary shed blood and tears to defend Catholicism, only for the throne to fall into Elizabeth's hands, the very symbol of Protestant England. If this story were written into a film script, the audience would probably say, unrealistic. The writer deliberately sabotaged the protagonist. Looking back, you realize Mary's tragedy did not lie in her being a cruel queen, but in her being a woman consumed by her own obsessions. In the midst of a powerful court, in the middle of diplomatic and military decisions, Mary slipped into a personal cycle: hope, disappointment, panic, then hope again. It sounds like the cycle of dieting, gaining weight, dieting again that many modern people experience. Except Mary's price was far more devastating. And so, year after year, relapse after relapse, Mary grew increasingly exhausted. When she died in the year 1558, at the age of 42, her reign closed with silence more than mourning. The name Bloody Mary endured, but the true story of a queen betrayed by her own body was overshadowed by the blood-stained pages of history. Think about it: if Mary had borne a child, would English history have turned another way? Historians still debate whether England would have skipped the glorious Elizabethan age and instead slid into a thoroughly Catholic Europe. That question, of course, will never have an answer. But when you close your eyes and let your mind drift through the story, you will see a modern lesson: power, fame, or love. All can devour you if you place your entire worth in a single thing. Mary placed it all in the role of motherhood. And in the end, that choice shaped one of the greatest tragedies in English history. You are lying there listening to the hum of a fan, and I will take you back to the early 16th century, when a little girl was born in a royal palace. Yet her destiny was not a radiant fairy tale, but a song filled with dark notes. That child was Mary Tudor, later Mary I of England. Mary was born on February 18th, 1516, at Greenwich Palace close to the Thames, where the cold winter wind often slipped through every window. You can picture it: the palace rejoiced when King Henry VIII, the proud monarch, finally had a surviving child. But wait, there was one detail that annoyed Henry. The child was a girl. Mary's father, Henry VIII. You've surely heard plenty about the king with 6 wives, who broke with the Pope just to marry Anne Boleyn. He was famous for being charming, ruthless, and gluttonous. If Instagram had existed then, Henry would have shown off pictures of himself riding horses, playing tennis, with hashtags like #RoyalLife number fit king, but the truth was that as he aged, he grew obese, sick, and notorious for decisions that cut deep without hesitation. Mary's mother was Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the royal couple who united Spain and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage. Catherine was intelligent, composed, and devoted to her family. Imagine this. Mary grew up carrying both the blood of the English Tudors and the Spanish Trastámaras, two cultures of immense power. From early on, Mary received special attention. Records tell us she was an exceptional student. By the age of 9, Mary could play the clavichord and speak fluent Latin, French, and Spanish. In today's comparison, she would be that top student who excels at piano and speaks 3 languages, while proud parents boast about her all over Facebook. But behind the dazzling image, Mary's destiny began to darken. One defining event shaped Mary's entire childhood at 17. Henry VIII decided to divorce her mother Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. This became the spark that split the Church of England from Rome. Mary, once a legitimate princess, was suddenly declared illegitimate. Imagine a child raised like a jewel, suddenly stamped in official papers as illegitimate. It was heartbreak, not unlike being publicly unfriended on social media today. Historians still debate whether Mary at that time was simply a fragile girl weeping over her lost status, or whether this shock forged her into the hard, dark, and determined figure she later became. Either way, one thing is certain. Mary's childhood was far from golden. After her mother was cast aside and lived her last years in sorrow, Mary was almost forbidden to see Catherine. The young girl lived apart, with fragile health and constant emotional strain. Physicians recorded that Mary often suffered stomach pains and irregular menstruation symptoms of conditions that would haunt her later life. Some argue that it was not only genetics, but also the mental anguish that weakened her body. But do not forget, Mary also had some admirable stubborn moments. When Henry VIII ordered her to sign a document admitting she was a bastard and denying her mother, Mary flatly refused. Imagine a 17-year-old girl, standing alone under the pressure of an entire court, daring to resist the most powerful man in the country. If compared to today, Mary would surely be the kind of student who dares to argue with teachers when faced with injustice, even knowing she would lose conduct points. After Henry married Jane Seymour and had a son, Edward, Mary's position became even more isolated. She was no longer considered a valuable heir, but thanks to her resilient character and the quiet support of Catholic subjects, Mary still held a considerable place. In the hearts of many, she was not only the disgraced princess, but also a symbol of persecuted faith. One little-known detail in her youth: Mary was very popular thanks to her modest appearance and refined social skills. Anecdotes say that at one banquet, Mary played and sang in Spanish, leaving the ambassadors in awe. They wrote home that the English princess is both charming and wise. If not for her family tragedies, Mary might have followed the path of a princess, Charming married off across Europe to cement alliances. But history rarely bends to human wishes. When Henry VIII died, the throne passed to Edward VI, Mary's Protestant half-brother, who of course looked unfavourably upon her. The Catholic sister. During his reign, Mary lived almost under surveillance, always at risk of being cut from the line of succession. Yet, as fortune or irony would have it, Edward died young at 15, and so, in the year 1553, Mary unexpectedly became Queen of England. The moment Mary rode into London, greeted by thousands of cheering subjects, was a deeply emotional event. To them, she was not only a small woman who had endured injustice, but also hope for the return of Catholicism. Historians still debate, was this support born of religious loyalty, or sympathy for Mary's personal tragedy? Perhaps both? You see, from a child born to ringing bells, Mary's journey was one of turbulence, from legitimate princess to discarded bastard, from a steadfast young woman to a symbol of hope, and finally, to queen. This was the turning point that shaped Mary's character, her fierce religious conviction, her resilience in adversity, but also the seeds of obsession and melancholy. And now, knowing whose daughter Mary was, the world she grew up in, and why her soul carried so many shadows, we move on to another chapter, her years on the throne, where personal pain and politics merged into one of the darkest reigns in English history. Close your eyes and imagine a July morning in 1553. The sky over London, silver grey, hooves thunder on the cobbled streets. And in the centre rides Mary Tudor, the one once called Bastard, entering the city on a white horse. Crowds pressed close, cheering, waving Catholic banners, singing as if a miracle had taken place. A small woman, red-haired, thin-faced but with blazing eyes, was now officially Mary I, Queen of England. This was a monumental event for the first time. A woman ascended the English throne as the rightful sovereign, not as a king's wife or mother. Think of it in the 16th century, when people still believed women belonged only in kitchens and birthing chambers. Mary on horseback was a massive plot twist. If Twitter had existed, the hashtag number Queen Mary would have trended within minutes. Mary understood. Well, the crown on her head was not just a symbol of power, but also her chance to prove that all the years of humiliation had not been in vain. And she chose a very clear path to bring England back to Catholicism. In the very first months of her reign, Mary began dismantling her brother Edward VI's religious reforms. Protestant churches were shut down, Catholic priests were restored, and ties with the Pope were renewed. This was a documented fact. Mary reinstated the Act of Repeal, officially bringing England back under the Vatican after nearly 20 years. But in that policy, you can see the shadow of a girl whose status had once been stripped away. For Mary, restoring Catholicism was not only politics, but deeply personal. As if she was declaring to the world, "My father was wrong to cast aside my mother, and I will restore it all." Another little-known fact in her first days as queen, Mary was still quite beloved. People called her Our Mary. They thought she would be a kind mother, uniting a divided nation. Folk songs praised her, hoping that Our Mary will bring the golden age back. But you and I both know that honeymoon did not last long. The biggest controversy surrounded Mary's marriage decision. She chose to marry Philip II, Prince of Spain, son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. For Mary, this union seemed destined. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a Spaniard, now returned to her maternal bloodline, while strengthening Europe's Catholic bloc. But the English people panicked. To them, Philip was no fairy tale prince, but a cold foreigner threatening to turn England into Spain's vassal. Historians still debate, did Mary truly love Philip, or was he merely political strategy? Some of Mary's private letters show she genuinely adored him, calling Philip my husband, my lord, with rare sweetness. But Philip did not. To him, Mary was more of a duty than a wife. Some joke that if Philip lived today, he would simply see Mary's messages and never reply. Their wedding on July 25th, 1554, took place at Winchester Cathedral. Picture a royal wedding, crimson robes, incense thick in the air, a choir's voice soaring through the nave. Mary was 38, Philip only 27, an age gap of 11 years that fueled gossip. Many nobles whispered, "This is not a wedding, but a political treaty dressed as a marriage." After the wedding, Mary lived in overflowing hope. If she bore a prince, the throne would be secure, Catholicism would be firm, and her love with Philip would be strengthened. And then, only a few months later, she announced joyous news. She was pregnant. London once again celebrated, The golden cradle was prepared, and even a list of nurses stood ready. But then, by July of 1555, no child was born. Mary's swollen belly was only a phantom pregnancy. It was a shock not only for her, but for the entire nation. Imagine that scene in modern life, like a company making a grand announcement of a new product, sending the whole market into anticipation, only for nothing to appear. Public trust collapsed overnight, and from this moment, the nickname Bloody Mary began to cling to her. In despair, Mary believed that only by cleansing the land of Protestants would God bless her with a child. Thus, a wave of executions began. More than 280 people were burned alive. From Archbishop Cranmer to ordinary believers, all perished in the flames. The eternal controversy remains: did Mary kill out of religious fanaticism, or because of her personal obsession with bearing a child? Some historians argue she merely did what any Catholic monarch of the time would have done, but others claim it was her failure at motherhood that turned her more brutal, as if seeking to fill the void with blood. You hear it and shudder. But there is also a touch of irony. If Mary had been a YouTuber today, perhaps her channel would be something like Extreme Makeover, Religious Edition. Anyone not fitting the style would be out instantly. In the court, tensions grew sharper. English nobles despised Philip, for he was quiet, cold, and often absent. The people trembled before the pyres, and Mary, in her heart, clung to one hope: a child. In 1557, she again believed she was pregnant. But once more, nothing came. The nation no longer believed in the Our Mary of old. She gradually became a symbol of failure, and then her health quickly declined: kidney failure, depression, and dropsy. You can almost hear in your imagination the church bells tolling steadily, no longer in celebration but in mourning. Damp London, cloaked in fog. And inside the palace, a queen slowly losing all hope. And then, the turning point came in November of 1558. Mary died at the age of 42, without children, without joy, leaving behind only a short reign and an unshakable haunting. The throne passed to Elizabeth, the half-sister, the Protestant symbol, the very opposite of everything Mary had fought for. You see, fate sometimes plays like a scriptwriter who loves to troll the protagonist. Mary spent her whole life restoring Catholicism and hoping for a child, only for the throne to end up in Elizabeth's hands, the one who led England into the Golden Age. Listen closely for a moment. Imagine the sound of rain tapping against the moss-covered tiles of St. James's Palace. No more noisy festivals. No more cheers for Our Mary. Only cold corridors, where flickering candles cast the fading shadow of a queen. That was Mary I in the last years of her life. Her body, fragile, since girlhood, now bore the marks of time and illness. Records state that Mary suffered from dropsy-swollen limbs, pale skin, along with kidney disease that left her in constant pain. One courtier once wrote in his diary, "Her Majesty cannot walk without help." Picture it: the same woman who once rode boldly into London, now leaning on a cane, dragging each step, gasping as if climbing 10 flights of stairs. One major event of record in 1558. Under Mary's rule, England's army failed and lost Calais, the last English foothold in France. It was a crushing blow. Mary once said that when she died, if her heart were cut open, the word Calais would be found engraved inside. You can see that in Mary's mind, political defeat and personal failure blended into one single wound. If social media had existed, the headlines would have screamed, "Queen Mary loses last piece of France and her will to live." A lesser-known fact in her final months: Mary was almost entirely abandoned by Philip II. The husband she had once loved so deeply had returned to Spain and sent only a few letters written in a cold tone. Some of them are even believed to have been penned by his secretary. Imagine it like a modern love story where the partner only drops the occasional like icon but never truly writes back. In the palace, Mary immersed herself in endless prayers. She wore black robes, knelt for hours before the altar, her lips murmuring prayer. But what historians debate is this: was it a sign of sincere devotion, or merely a desperate attempt to seek redemption? Some Catholic scholars see her as a political martyr, while Protestant historians view her as the model of fanaticism. You can feel the contrast clearly outside. The cold corridors and the pungent smell of herbs. Inside, Mary was a lonely woman, tormented to the core by her obsession with motherhood. Every morning she checked her body again, hoping for a sign that never came. Thus, the cycle of hope, disappointment, prayer, then hope again, repeated until exhaustion. Once, Mary believed she was pregnant yet again, even when doctors said it was impossible. Chronicles say she even prepared a nursery. But when her belly did not grow, the belief vanished. The court began to whisper, and the people mocked. You see, even in the 16th century, fake news had devastating power, no less than in the age of social media. While Mary drowned in tragedy, outside, her half-sister Elizabeth was increasingly loved by the people. Elizabeth was young, intelligent, skilled in diplomacy, and above all, unburdened by the obsession with producing an heir. If Mary was the image of a woman shackled by her own body, Elizabeth was the image of a free woman, turning her gender into an advantage. Historians still argue, would Elizabeth have been so successful if not for Mary's failure as a counterweight? Perhaps not. Mary's tragedy was the springboard for Elizabeth's legend. The world remembers Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, but few recall that her proud celibacy was the counterpoint to Mary's phantom pregnancies. In her final days, Mary grew more paranoid. She suspected even her closest attendants. Convinced that someone plotted to poison her, she lived in fear, locked herself in her chambers, and limited contact. If you have seen horror films where the reflection in the mirror betrays you, the scene at St. James's Palace then was not far different. One final event portrays the decline clearly. On November 17th, 1558, Mary drew her last breath. Aged 42, her reign lasted only 5 years short, yet marked by blood and tears. Her funeral was not grand, for the people had turned away. Many even sighed in relief when Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. One little-known detail: Mary was buried at Westminster Abbey, and later Elizabeth I was also laid to rest in the same tomb. The two sisters, once bitter rivals in life, ended up together under one stone. On it is carved the Latin inscription, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep." Sisters, Elizabeth and Mary. There is bitterness in this in life. They fought to the end. Yet in death, they were forced to share a roof of stone. You might laugh bitterly if there had been a choose-your-own burial chamber service at the time. Mary would surely have refused outright. No, I do not want to be with Elizabeth. But history often delights in such ironies. And now, when you look back at Mary's entire life, you see a spiral from princess stripped of her title, to proud Catholic queen, to a woman consumed by obsession and loneliness. Modern historians still debate, should we judge Mary as a tyrant, or as a victim of circumstance, of heredity, and of social pressure? Whatever the answer, Mary I leaves a very modern lesson when you place your entire worth into one single thing, whether love, power, or motherhood. It is easy to be swept away. And then, every other achievement, every other title, can vanish in the blink of an eye. Historians still debate, was the shared tomb a Stuart-era attempt after Elizabeth to send a message of reconciliation, or was it simply a practical decision by the Abbey's architect? Some Catholic scholars argue it was deeply unfair to Mary, who had sacrificed her life for the Catholic faith, now forced to share a room with a Protestant queen. the very symbol of what she opposed. Another lesser-known fact, well into the 17th century, some Catholics secretly visited Westminster to pray at Mary's tomb, seeing her as a martyr who had died for her faith. They often laid red roses on the stone, a symbol of loyalty. Protestants, however, did the opposite. They came to honor Elizabeth, calling Mary the darkness before the dawn. The same tomb carried two opposing meanings, like a forum where each side posted comments from its own perspective. One other strange detail: most of the decoration on the tomb focused on Elizabeth, not Mary. The Latin inscription may have named both sisters, but the sculpture above a white effigy of Elizabeth lying in majesty caused Mary to be forgotten, as if she were merely a lodger, while Elizabeth was the true owner. Art historians still argue, was this a political intention of the post-Elizabethan court to blur Mary's image in the memory of the people? Think about it. Sharing a tomb and still being overshadowed must feel pitiful. If Mary could speak, perhaps she would grumble. At least give me a small statue. But history, of course, never cared about fairness. Today, when you visit Westminster Abbey, guides often linger at Elizabeth's tomb, praising the Virgin Queen, who ushered in the Elizabethan Golden Age. Mary, meanwhile, is mentioned only in passing. Her sister lies here too. Bloody Mary. It is like two famous sisters, one an A-list star, the other remembered only as the star's sister. Yet some modern historians have begun to vindicate Mary. They argue she was not merely a bloodthirsty tyrant, but also a deeply tragic woman, crushed by health and political circumstance. The shared tomb at Westminster, they say, is the perfect symbol of that complexity. You cannot tell the story of Elizabeth without Mary. They are two sides of the same Tudor coin, one light, one shadow. There is an amusing twist. The famous cocktail Bloody Mary, though its name's origin is debated, is often linked by tourists to this queen when visiting the abbey. Guides sometimes joke, if you feel tired walking around the abbey, tonight order a Bloody Mary to remember her. A cruel irony from a queen obsessed with bearing children and faith. Her name is now tied to a vodka tomato drink. You see, Mary's tomb is not merely a resting place, but a mirror reflecting the rivalry of two sisters, reflecting history's unfair treatment of those who fail, and reflecting how people simplify the past into catchy labels. Elizabeth the Great Queen, Mary Bloody Mary. Just two lines, but they bury a lifetime. And perhaps, when you step out of Westminster Abbey and hear the bells tolling from the clock tower, you may feel the chill of marble still lingering on your skin. Mary, in silence, remains there, not just a name on a cocktail menu, but a soul who fought, who failed, and who now rests beside her opposite sister. A story both tragic and ironic, quintessential English history, where glory and misery always walk together. If you imagine yourself back at Westminster Abbey once more, this time you will see that Mary's tomb is not only religious or political, but also an open question for posterity. People have stood before that stone for over 4 centuries, and each generation has judged her through a different lens. One little-known detail: when Elizabeth I was buried alongside Mary in the year 1603, Mary's coffin was lowered, and Elizabeth's was placed above. Physically, Mary lies beneath, Elizabeth above. Many see this as an unconscious symbol of dominance, Elizabeth overshadowing Mary in life and in death. Conservation researchers at the Abbey reported that in the 18th century, when the tomb was inspected, they found 2 wooden coffins in the same stone vault, Elizabeth resting half a meter higher. At this, you may laugh bitterly. Mary, overshadowed all her life, even in death, was literally covered by Elizabeth's coffin lid. If this were a film script, the audience would surely say, the director is too cruel to Mary. In the funeral records, the contrast is stark. Elizabeth's funeral was magnificently staged, with a wooden effigy of the Queen carried through the streets, mourners weeping in masses. Mary's funeral, by contrast, was brief, sparsely attended, leaving few words of praise. Thus, the shared tomb emphasizes the contrast even more, one hailed as glorious, the other dismissed as failure. Yet silence around Mary's tomb slowly changed over time. By the 19th century, as English historiography shifted from propaganda to scholarly study, feminist historians began to pay more attention to Mary. They lit candles by her grave and asked, was Mary condemned unfairly simply because she failed in the role of motherhood? The tomb became a gathering point for fierce academic debate. Historians still argue to this day, was Mary truly as bloodthirsty as the image of Bloody Mary? Or was she the product of a society unwilling to tolerate queens who could not bear children? The tomb at Westminster, silent as stone, remains the stage for countless essays, conferences, and even modern dark tourism tours. One detail few notice when visiting the tomb: the slab does not record Mary's birth and death years. It only bears the names of the two sisters and the Latin inscription of praise. This surprises many visitors. Was she not worthy of her own stone? Some say it is like going to a group meeting, doing all the work, and then having your name written in tiny letters at the bottom of the list. Mary, though a queen, had to accept being the shadow even on her own grave. Today, visitors to Westminster Abbey still stop at Mary's tomb, but mostly to talk about Elizabeth. Some guides joke with tourists. There are two queens down here. One brought the light, the other brought the cocktail. Indeed, Mary's image in popular culture is more tied to the Bloody Mary drink than to her political policies. Yet, Catholic pilgrims still come to light candles at Mary's grave. They see her as the martyr queen, a queen who suffered for faith, who tried to restore Catholicism in a turbulent era. To them, this tomb is not a symbol of failure, but a mark of loyalty to the end. If you sit quietly in the abbey, listening to the organ echo above, you might feel as if Mary is still present. Not a cannibal queen, as rumour once painted. Not merely the bloodthirsty demon of the Bloody Mary name, but a woman of contradictions, both fragile and strong. Devout and obsessed. Victim and culprit. And perhaps that is what this shared tomb reminds us. History is never as simple as the labels we place on it. Beneath cold marble, between two coffins stacked together, he lie countless layers of meaning of family, of power, of injustice, and of the memory humanity always seeks to simplify. You still remember that shared tomb, don't you, Mary and Elizabeth, two sisters? Two Lestinias, two opposites. They rest there, closing the Tudor era of brilliance, but also of blood and tears. And then, think about it, after Elizabeth I, the last legendary Tudor queen, closed her eyes in the year 1603, what happened next? Who would wear the golden crown after her? This was the crucial transition. For here, the Tudor dynasty, which began with Henry VII after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, officially ended. Elizabeth I died without children, without a direct heir, and when a dynasty ends with the throne empty, you know what happens? A whole line of distant relatives rushes in to claim kinship. The official event, the English throne, was handed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. He was the grandson of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. In other words, though the Tudor line ended, the crown still passed to a cousin by blood. This moment in history marked the birth of the Stuart dynasty. An interesting little fact: many English nobles at the time considered other candidates, including descendants of the Suffolk line. But in the end, James VI had the strongest advantage. He was Protestant and already ruling stably in Scotland. And so, overnight, the two kingdoms of England and Scotland shared one monarch, the perfect by one, Get one free combo you would find in supermarkets today. Historians still debate, was the choice of James I inevitable? Or did Elizabeth secretly designate him before her death? Some claim Elizabeth once called James her natural heir, but others argue this was rumour spread by Stuart supporters. Whatever the truth, from 1603 onward, the Tudor flag no longer flew, and the crown had a new owner. Imagine the scene then, London still in mourning for Elizabeth the Queen, so beloved that people called her Good Queen Bess. Yet only weeks later, the city welcomed a new king from the north. To the people, James I was a stranger. His accent, Scottish. His manner awkward, lacking the legendary aura of Queen Elizabeth. Some even mocked. From Angel Elizabeth to King James, it is like switching from symphony to bagpipes droning without end. But you see, though James lacked Elizabeth's personal radiance, he brought something new. The union of the English and Scottish crowns. The beginning of the process that would form the United Kingdom. If Elizabeth closed a golden age, James opened a new chapter, where politics, religion, and fresh intrigues began to surge. And so, when you step out of Westminster Abbey, leaving behind the tomb of Mary and Elizabeth, you are walking into another journey of history. For after the farewell bells of the Tudors, all of England entered an entirely new dynasty, the Stuarts, where the throne was no longer a story of sisters, but the story of an island nation about to change its face forever. The first official historical event under James I was the so-called Union of the Crowns. For the first time, England and Scotland shared a single monarch. Imagine it as two rival companies suddenly having the same CEO. On paper, it sounded perfect. But in practice, employees still quarrelled, and departments still envied one another. The English saw the Scots as provincials, while the Scots thought the English arrogant. One little-known fact, James I loved to boast that he was Rex Pacificus, the King of Peace. He was proud of having signed a peace treaty with Spain, ending decades of war under Elizabeth. But behind that glittering title, his court began to splinter. The English nobility considered James somewhat vulgar. He loved feasting, loved hunting, and especially loved drinking. Records say James often drank so much strong liquor that his face flushed red. His hands shook. And yet he would still deliver passionate speeches on royal virtue. You might think of him as the kind of boss who insists on drinking to discuss company business. Yet James's greatest legacy was not on the banquet table, but in a book. Yes, it was under his reign that the King James Bible, 1611, was produced. This was a linguistic masterpiece, shaping the style of English for centuries. Many familiar modern phrases, the powers that be, labour of love, or by the skin of one's teeth, all come from this translation. If today quoting Shakespeare sounds refined, 17th century Englishmen quoted the King James Bible for the same effect. But not everything was as holy as Scripture. One of the most shocking events of James's reign was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. You must have heard the name Guy Fawkes, the masked figure we now see in the film V for Vendetta. The original plan of Fawkes and his fellow conspirators was to blow up Parliament on opening day, killing James and the Protestant nobility, to restore Catholicism in England. Picture the scene: a cramped cellar under Parliament, barrels of gunpowder stacked high, flickering candles, and plotters whispering. It sounds like a modern thriller, but the plan failed disastrously. Guy Fawkes was caught just before lighting the fuse. He was later executed publicly. Since then, on November 5th each year, the English have lit fireworks and shouted, "Remember! Remember the 5th of November." Historians still debate, was this truly the work of Catholic extremists, or partly staged by the government as an excuse for repression? Some evidence suggests royal agents allowed the plan to develop, only to catch them red-handed at the last moment. It seems like a scripted play to justify harsher laws. You see, The trick of setting the trap and then arresting was hardly invented in modern times. Another curious detail: James I believed deeply in witches. Before he became King of England, while still King of Scotland, he personally took part in witch trials. He believed the devil truly existed and was plotting against him. His obsession was so strong, he even wrote a book, Demonology, explaining how to identify and punish witches. If James lived today, he would surely be a regular guest on television shows about spiritual mysteries. But his suspicion did not end with witches. In politics, James constantly clashed with Parliament. He believed in the divine right of kings, that a king ruled by God's will, not by election or Parliament's permission. Parliament, meanwhile, thought, sorry, times have changed. We want a say too. The result was constant debates. Like a company meeting where the boss insists I am always right while employees demand the right to speak. The key transition here is this. Although James tried to maintain his image as Rex Pacificus, the conflicts he sowed with Parliament, combined with his rule based on favoritism and corruption at court, planted the seeds of tension that later exploded under his son, Charles I. And you know how that ended, with the English Civil War and the sight of a king on the scaffold. Looking back, you see James I as a kind of bridge. On one side, the Tudor brilliance with the legendary Elizabeth I. On the other, the stormy skies of the 17th century Civil War. His reign was not dazzling, but it was laden with contradictions. And from the tomb of Mary and Elizabeth at Westminster, you can walk further along the path of history, seeing that every dynasty carries its own reminder. Glory never lasts forever. And sometimes, the seeds of tragedy are sown very early. And so, let your mind drift back to London. Around the 1620s, the church bells rang steadily. But inside the palace, the air was no longer peaceful. James I had just died, and the crown passed to his son Charles I. Charles was quite different from his father. He was small in stature, walked with a limp due to a weak leg, and spoke with a slight stammer. But he carried himself with a formal dignity. Fond of neat dress and a well-groomed beard, if James I resembled a jovial uncle who loved feasts, Charles was like a gentleman who loved to pose for portraits in a studio. People said Charles always believed his image had to be perfect, so much so that he was the first English king to hire the famed painter Anthony van Dyck for official portraits. If Instagram had existed, his account would have been filled with portrait shots filtered to perfection. One official event at the start of his reign, Charles I married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess. It sounded romantic, but in reality, it caused an uproar. England was tense with Catholic-Protestant division, and Charles had married a Catholic beauty who brought along an entourage of priests. People feared England would be dragged back under Rome. Imagine it like a new CEO immediately signing a lucrative contract with the arch-rival shareholders panicking, employees gossiping. Not only his marriage, but also his ruling style stirred controversy. Charles firmly believed in the divine right of kings, that a king ruled by God's will, not Parliament's approval. Parliament. Meanwhile, I thought, hold on. We hold the purse. If the king wants money, he must negotiate. Thus, through the 1620s and 30s, Charles was in constant conflict with Parliament. Once, in Enger, he dissolved it and ruled alone for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule. A little-known fact: during this one-man reign, Charles searched for every way to raise money. He revived long-abandoned taxes, like ship money, a levy originally imposed only on coastal towns to support the navy. But Charles forced even inland counties to pay. The people were outraged, thinking, there are no ships in our village. Why pay ship money? Sound familiar? It is like being charged a toll fee in a place without a bridge. Tensions escalated when Charles tried to impose the Book of Common Prayer on Scotland. Where Presbyterian tradition was strong, the Scots resisted fiercely, rising in rebellion. Charles lacked the funds to keep his army, so he was forced to recall Parliament, and thus, after 11 years of silence, the quarrel between king and Parliament erupted, fiercer than ever. The next official turning point, the English Civil War, 1642-1651, two sides emerged. The king's supporters, the royalists or cavaliers, with gleaming helmets, bright red cloaks, often depicted as dashing horsemen, and Parliament supporters, the Roundheads, with cropped hair, plain armour, led by Oliver Cromwell. From afar, it looked like two cosplay teams with very different styles. One side flashy nobles, the other disciplined country soldiers. Scholarly debate has long continued. Was the English Civil War merely a political conflict, or the first social revolution in Europe? Some see it as the foundation for modern parliamentary democracy. Others insist it remained a power struggle among elites. Either way, blood was spilled on many battlefields from Edge Hill to Naseby, and gradually, the balance tipped in Parliament's favour. A curious fact, Charles I, even while imprisoned, maintained aristocratic habits. He read books, played chess, and insisted tea be served at the proper hour. Some accounts say he even debated theology with his guards. Imagine a captured king calmly keeping up afternoon tea at 4, as if clinging to his gentlemanly image in a prison cell. The climax in 1649. Parliament put Charles I on trial, something unprecedented in English history. A king, judged by his own people. The court declared him guilty of treason for placing personal interest above the nation, and on January 30th, 1649, Charles I was led to the scaffold at Whitehall. Picture it, a freezing London winter. Light snow falling. A packed crowd holding its breath in silence. Charles wore 2 shirts, so he would not shiver, lest people think he was afraid. Before placing his head on the block, he spoke words. Long remembered, I am your king. Idea faithful man. Then, the blade fell, and England entered a kingless period, known as the Commonwealth, under Oliver Cromwell. This was a defining historical turning point for the first time. The English had overthrown and executed their own monarch, a sight that, if told to Henry VIII, would have drawn a scoff. Ridiculous, who would dare with me? But the truth was, the age had changed. One strange detail around Charles's death, many witnesses said that when his head fell, the crowd surged forward to soak handkerchiefs in his blood as keepsakes. To them, the king's blood was sacred. Morbid as it sounds, it reflected the mindset of the time, both hatred of and reverence for royal power. And so, as you listen to this story, you see a current from the tomb of Mary and Elizabeth at Westminster to the crown of James I with the King James Bible, then to Charles I, the only English king ever publicly executed. A Stuart dynasty that began with the ambition of peace slid, within only a few decades, into war and tragedy. Imagine the morning of January 31st, 1649, the day after Charles I was executed. No king, an empty throne. It was a sight the English people had never seen. For centuries, there had always been a king or queen, whether wise or cruel. And now, for the first time, England declared, "We shall be a republic." It sounded fashionable, like modern democracy. But remember, the 17th century had no concept of democracy as we know it. England became a chaotic political experiment, controlled by those who had triumphed in the Civil War Parliament's faction, and especially one man, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was not born a grand noble. He was only a middling landowner in Huntingdon, but by military skill rose to generalship. His troops were called the New Model Army, a disciplined force fired by religious zeal, and fiercely loyal to Cromwell. In modern terms, Cromwell was like the CEO of a small startup, but with discipline and all-in spirit. He quickly toppled the giant corporations. One official event in 1649. Immediately after Charles's execution, the new regime proclaimed the Commonwealth of England. Parliament formally held power. But in truth, Cromwell and his army made the real decisions. A little-known fact, Cromwell was deeply devout. Believing himself an instrument of God, he often prayed through the night before battle. Once he told his soldiers, "Fight as if everything depended on you, but pray as if everything depended on God." If you have ever had a boss who assigns a brutal deadline and then says pray for it, Cromwell was the 17th century version. Soon after taking power, Cromwell faced new enemies, Ireland and Scotland, both still loyal to the Stuart crown. In 1640–950, he led campaigns in Ireland, and at Drogheda and Wexford, his forces massacred thousands. This was a bloody event, leaving centuries of hatred. Historians still debate, was Cromwell deliberately committing genocide against the Irish? Or was it simply brutal warfare by the standards of the time? To the Irish, he was a demon. To many English, he was the saviour who secured the nation from rebellion. Even today, Cromwell's statues spark dispute in Britain. Some cities keep them. Others demand their removal. Back in London, Parliament became increasingly useless. Cromwell grew frustrated with MPs he saw as corrupt and quarrelsome. By 1653, he lost patience. Cromwell marched soldiers into Parliament, slammed his cane on the floor, and declared, "You have sat here too long. Begone." Then he dissolved Parliament. It sounds like a scene from a comedy film, but it was real. A strange detail afterward. Cromwell created the so-called bare-bones Parliament, filling it with men he thought were godly, but it lasted only a few months before collapsing. Finally, Cromwell declared himself Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, the head of state. In other words, they had abolished a king, only to end up with a king without a crown. Imagine it like a company announcing no more CEO. We will self-manage, only to end up with an interim CEO even more powerful than the old one. Under Cromwell, social life grew austerer. He banned singing, dancing, and theatre, even restricted Christmas celebrations, calling them vain extravagance. Londoners nicknamed him the man who quenched joy. Picture it: no films, not music, no festivals, an entire nation forced into spiritual fasting for years. Historians still debate, was Cromwell's regime truly a republic, or simply a military dictatorship clothed in moral language? Some hail him as the father of English parliamentary democracy, while others say he was nothing less than England's Napoleon. Oliver Cromwell died in 1658. His funeral was as grand as that of any king, with a velvet-covered coffin paraded solemnly through the streets. But only 2 years later, the kingless regime collapsed. His son, Richard Cromwell, lacking credibility and ability, was quickly overthrown. And in 1660, the English people joyfully welcomed Charles II, the son of Charles I, back from exile, restoring the Stuart monarchy. This transition was both tragic and ironic after decades of war. After executing a king and experimenting with republicanism, the English ended up returning to a king, as if history had taken a great circle, only to return to the starting point. Picture a spring morning in 1660. On the docks of Dover, flags fluttered, crowds cheered, brass horns blared. A tall, slender figure with long curly hair waving in the wind smiled and waved back. It was Charles II, the exiled son of Charles I, returning to reclaim the throne after Cromwell's regime had crumbled. This official event is called the Restoration. After years of the English Commonwealth, people finally realized that without a king, Everything was far more chaotic. And so Charles II took the throne with thunderous welcome. He was called the Merry Monarch for his generous character, love of feasts, passion for the arts, and passion for women. One little-known fact upon his return to England: Charles II promised to forgive and forget those who had opposed his father. He called it the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion. It sounded magnanimous, but not entirely. Some who had signed the death warrant of Charles I were still executed brutally. Forgiveness for all except those who had laid hands on his father's head. The life of Charles II resembled one long banquet. He restored theatres, reopened taverns, encouraged music and the arts. This was the age when English drama flourished with witty comedies, daring performances, and, for the first time, women on stage instead of men in disguise. If he lived today, Charles II would be a fan of Broadway and Netflix. But England under Charles II was not only laughter. One grim official event was the Great Plague of 1665. The Black Death returned to London, killing more than 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city's population. Imagine empty streets, shuttered houses, red crosses painted on infected doors, with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Meanwhile, Charles and the court withdrew from the city, leaving the people to fend for themselves. And just as people breathed a sigh of relief after the plague subsided, another disaster struck in 1666, the Great Fire of London. Flames began in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, then spread swiftly, consuming more than 13,000 houses, and most of the city centre. They said the entire sky glowed red, the air thick with hot winds and falling ash. Imagine London as a giant torch, burning for 4 straight days. Academic debate still surrounds that fire. Was it merely an accident from the bakery, or sabotage? At the time, many blamed foreigners, especially the French and the Dutch, England's great enemy. One Frenchman was even executed unjustly after confessing in panic that he lit the fire. But modern historians nearly all agree it was only an accident, worsened by flammable wooden buildings. One little-known fact during the fire: Charles II himself went into the streets to direct firefighting, even carrying water buckets. That image helped him regain public affection, at least briefly. For all his love of revelry, Charles could roll up his sleeves in crisis. Beyond disasters, Charles's private life became endless gossip. He was famous for having countless mistresses and at least 12 illegitimate children, yet no legitimate heir with his queen, Catherine of Braganza. People joked that the Stuart court was like a giant nursery, where anyone might be the king's child. Given enough convincing proof, if DNA testing had existed in the 17th century, the monarchy would have needed its own laboratory. Yet Charles II also left a cultural legacy. Under his reign, the Royal Society of Science was founded, where figures like Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke began shaping humanity's scientific future. In other words, while Charles partied, the intellectuals were busy inventing the universe. The key transition Charles II's reign allowed England to forget the spectre of civil war, but also planted new seeds of tension. He had no legitimate heir, so the crown would pass to his brother James, Duke of York, and James was a Catholic. In 17th century Protestant England, the rise of a Catholic king was nothing less than the spark for a political powder keg. You remember when Charles II died, don't you? The people of London mourned their merry monarch, but they also knew one thing: the crown would pass to his brother James, Duke of York. And so, in 1685, James ascended the throne, becoming James II of England and James VII of Scotland. It may have sounded smooth, but there was a great plot twist. James was a Catholic in a country that was overwhelmingly Protestant. Imagine it like a company running smoothly. when suddenly a new CEO arrives and declares, "From now on, we'll use an entirely different software system shareholders blanche. Employees Spanitz." The first official event of James II's reign. As soon as he ascended the throne, he announced a policy of religious tolerance. It sounded humane, but to many Protestants, it was a sign that England is about to return to the Pope's embrace. And that fear was not only rumour. James appointed Catholic officials, expanded rights for Catholics, and even considered forming a private army loyal only to himself. A little-known fact, James II had a fairly successful naval career. Before becoming king, he was Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy, reforming the fleet and laying the foundation for England's future sea power. In other words, he was no novice in governance, but his overpowering religious convictions cost him dearly in the eyes of the people. Less than a year after James took the throne, a rebellion erupted, the Monmouth Rebellion. Charles II's illegitimate son, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, declared himself the rightful king and led an uprising against James II. The rebels were quickly defeated at the Battle of Sedgemoor, and Monmouth was executed. But what terrified the public more were the brutal trials afterward, known as the Bloody Assizes. Presided over by Judge George Jeffreys, hundreds were hanged or transported to the colonies. The nickname Bloody Assizes sounds like the title of a gory television series today. Historians still debate, did James deliberately allow such harsh trials to intimidate? Or did Jeffreys himself go too far? Either way, the image of James II's reign was clouded by fear. James continued to unsettle the public when he openly attended Catholic Mass and built a Catholic chapel right inside the palace. For Protestants, this was no different than declaring, "I will bring England back to Rome." Then, in 1682, the pivotal event, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. It should have been joyous, for the king finally had an heir. But for Protestant nobles, it was a thunderbolt. The English crown would fall into Catholic hands. Before this, many had hoped the throne would pass to James's two Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. Now, those hopes vanished. A little-known tidbit, some in the court spread the rumour that the newborn prince was not the true child at all, but a mystery baby smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. This became known as the warming pan scandal. Absurd as it sounds, the rumour spread across London and became the talk of the city. You see, fake news back then could be just as explosive as on social media today. The story built to its climax. English nobles could not accept the prospect of a long Catholic dynasty, so they secretly sent letters inviting William of Orange, husband of Princess Mary, James's Protestant daughter, to bring an army to save the nation. In November 1688, William landed in England with his Dutch forces, and the most surprising thing happened. There were virtually no major battles. James's soldier deserted en masse. Nobles turned their backs, and the people welcomed William with cheers. James II panicked and fled to France. This was the Glorious Revolution, so called because it was nearly bloodless. The official result, William and Mary were offered the crown jointly by Parliament, becoming William III and Mary II. For the first time, Parliament played the central role in deciding who ruled. At the same time, the Bill of Rights of 1689 was passed, a foundational document of England's constitutional monarchy. From then on, no king could enact laws or levy taxes without Parliament's consent. Scholarly debate still lingers. Was this truly a revolution or merely an aristocratic coup? Some historians see it as a triumph of parliamentary liberty. Others as the mere replacement of an unpopular dynasty with a more convenient one. Either way, the consequences were clear from 1688 onward. Parliament's power grew, while the monarchs dwindled. You see, from the tragic death of Charles I, through Cromwell's stern rule, to the revelry of Charles II, and finally, James II's deposition, English history had gone full circle. And as you listen to this story, you may smile sometimes. The most glorious revolutions require no swords at all, only a fleeing king and a cheering crowd. So, you and I have journeyed far together from the dark tomb of Mary I and Elizabeth to the glittering Stuart era, through Charles I's bloody end, Cromwell's severe years, Charles II's return of merriment, and finally James II's fall in the Glorious Revolution. Looking back, you see history as a multi-episode film, sometimes fierce as battle, sometimes sweet as a banquet, sometimes silent as a long night in a cloister. And though rulers come and go, though crowns pass from hand to hand, the tales remind us of one simple truth: power may be grand, but people remain fragile. Thrones may shine, but the hearts that sit upon them tremble like any other. Now, you may let your mind rest and close this journey. Imagine the soft wind whispering through the stone vaults of Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens lie in silence. All intrigues, all wars, all fears have faded, leaving only the still breath of night. May you sleep deeply and gently. Let history keep whispering in your ear, like a solemn lullaby. And when you wake tomorrow, may today's worries feel like dust upon the pages of your own life's chronicle. Good night.